Hello and welcome to Chapter 9 of the King's Indian Masterclass. Today, we're going to be exploring the move 7, Bishop e3. This is known as the Gligoric system. It arises from the main line of the King's Indian, and as I mentioned again on move 7, Bishop e3 is played. So first, what's the main idea for white? The main idea for white is that they're trying to trick us. If you recall the main line of castles, knight c6, d5, knight e7, here white has some trouble developing their bishop and knight. Because if they want their knight to be the most active on the queen side, it comes to d2, but then their bishop can't develop. If they want to develop their bishop to the best square on e3, the knight needs to come to e1, and then they play bishop e3, and we get into, sort of the main line with f5 and f4 and bishop f2. So they can't really place both of these pieces on their optimal squares, because if they begin by bishop e3 with the idea of then going knight e2, we can stop that with knight to g4. So their idea, going back to the Gligoric with bishop e3 here, is they're hoping that we're going to start by playing knight c6 and that we will transpose into the variation where they trick us with knight d2, because we can no longer come knight g4 and hit the bishop, and on their very next move they're going to castle. And if you realize, we've transposed into that variation that I said that we wouldn't get to, because here the bishop and the knight are perfectly placed in the main line, and so white has a pretty healthy advantage. It's almost like the bishop is perfectly placed on f2 to hit this diagonal, but the knight hasn't, met that concession that we're waiting for with knight e1. It's far more active on d2. So that's the main idea for white. They're trying to get an ideal setup, a perfect setup. But there's a very simple way for us to stop this from happening. We play the move knight g4 here, right? Before they take away that square from our knight, we put the knight here, we're attacking the bishop, we're not letting their bishop sit here. Therefore, their bishop needs to move. Now, it doesn't really make sense to retreat in this position because our knight, hasn't made any concession. So bishop g5 is the exclusively played move in this position. Here, we're going to continue by going f6. We hit the bishop, and now they do have a decision to make. They can play bishop c1. We'll look at this one a little later in the video because it's a sideline. It's not very popular. Their idea is that the move f6 is a small concession that they've basically invoked from us, because now there are, certain weaknesses in our position. Namely, this diagonal here is a little bit more loose for us. Also, the knight can't now return to f6, and it's going to have to likely sit on h6. So that's a possibility for them. But far more likely is bishop h4. And here, the fun continues. We go g5. We hit the bishop again. Bishop g3. And in this position, we bring the knight back to h6. Now, I'm very quickly going to go back. Just for those wondering, the reason bishop d2 is not played is because there is now issues on the d4 pawn. The queen no longer hits it. So we can take, then we can go f5. It's not defended, the knight, because the bishop's on d2. So the knight's going to have to spend a time going back. We can use that time in a variety of ways. We can develop, for example, and then there's already some ideas of taking and taking here. Black has the initiative in these positions. The bishop is just not well placed here. They might as well go to c1 if they're already going to come to d2, because the queen, at least there, is active hitting d4. So bishop h4, main line, we're going to begin with this knight h6. And ladies and gentlemen, this is the main position. Here, white needs to make a very committal decision. Are they going to push d5 or take on e5? Now, both of these decisions in regards to how the center is going to look are not going to really be met with different approaches. We're largely going to maintain a very similar strategic plan against both of these options. And that plan consists of attacking on the king side. So this early expansion of f6, g5 to hit the bishop was just the beginning of our pressure that we're going to add. The main idea we're going for here is f5 and then f4 and just pushing our pawns on the king side. Now, it is true that when the center is closed, it is easier to attack on the king side because there's no counterplay we have to watch out for in the center, right? So if you see the move d5 in this position, we'll look at this a little later, but that's generally a good sign because now our attack is going to be a bit more justified and easy to pull off. The slightly more critical option is for them to take here. And their point is that after we take back, they want to use the space in the center and the openness of the center to stop our kingside approach, an expansion of f5 and f4 to be as effective. They're going to get some counterplay. This is why we are happy to trade queens, and we're going to very quickly offer a queen trade by taking with the d pawn, because if the queens go off, then the attack on the king side is easier to pull off, because even though the center is open, they don't have that same manpower to utilize that center. They don't have the queen to generate a huge and deadly attack. So we're threatening, we're really offering the queen trade. Now, if they take, that's great for us. Our rook gets the open d file. The main move here, the best move, is queen d5. This is the critical one. We don't want to take and give their knight either a very strong square or their pawn structure a lot more stability, and then also the open c file. So we're going to go king h8. We're simply going to sidestep this check. Now, again, if they take, we're happy to take control of the d file. So they're going to castle. And here we go queen e7. And our point is to utilize this very exposed queen for our benefit. So at some point, there's ideas of bishop e6. There's ideas of getting a rook to the d file and just gaining some tempo from this queen. So queen to a5, they're logically trying to sidestep all of those tempo gaining moves. But now notice that they're also baiting us to go knight c6, which seems like it gets tempo on the queen, but we actually want to go c6 because knight c6 surrenders both of these squares for the knight. And for example, already here, knight d5 is strong. So one of the main things in this endgame, when the center is open, the knight has a lot of prospects. Shut that off with c6. This is a critical move to know. The knight still has for us a lot of squares and ways to get into the game, so we're happy to shut this off. We're now going to follow a game here by Rajabov with the black side that will illustrate the main strategical plan in these positions, which, as I mentioned earlier, is to expand with f5. And in this position, notice that after b6, the queen is hit, bishop d7, the queen is x-rayed a little bit, and c5, eventually the move f5 is indeed played for black. Now, you want to be careful, of course, when you play f5. You don't want to do it prematurely, especially, obviously, when the knight is here. f5 often will lose the pawn, not here because the queen defends, but eventually that is something to take notice of. When the knight moves, that is when you can begin thinking about f5, but I like the approach here of playing a little bit on the queen side first, gaining some space, gaining some tempo, getting your pieces out, knight to c6 here, threatening to go knight d4, sidestepping, of course, the pressure with the knight. So one of the downsides of playing c5 is that you surrender the square. So it was, very much a consideration that black decided to make. They're going to give away the d5 square, but then make their knight very powerful on d4. But now f5, of course, is what we're going for, and it is played in this position. So Rajabov continued by planting his knight in the center square. We had rook coming to the open d file. Now, this is sort of the key distinction between when the center is open and when it's closed. Our pressure and moves on the king side have been very similar. We expand, we gain some space, some control in the dark squares. But this move here, bringing the rook from the king side to the center, this is unique to when the center is open. There's no point in bringing the rook to the center if the center is closed. So you just need to be a bit more flexible and play a bit more holistically on both sides of the board and the center when it's open. You just want to be a bit more patient in your king side attack and not put all of your eggs in that basket. You want to play a little bit more varied, right? You want to play on all sides of the board, because ultimately if you don't, then they're going to gain a lot of initiative on the sides that you're neglecting to play on. So there was this nice reroute of the knight, and that is something that I didn't really touch on. The knight on h6 seems like a really bad piece, but it supports the move f5, and at some point if they take, the knight can jump in, and if they don't, that's fine. The knight has ways to maneuver into the game regardless. So the game here is roughly equal. Black is better, and that is largely because of the expansion on the king side, kind of paired with the very safe and solid pawn structure, along with the knight that can activate. The two bishops here are far less powerful because the center is closed and it's in our possession. We have more control of space. We're simply, have a far more space in this position. Eventually, there was a trade as well on f3. The knight came to b4. We had rook to g8. The way that this game ended was quite beautiful. Here, we're already winning as black completely. And again, that is largely due to our extra space and just piece activity. We have far more control in this position, but the game ended very beautifully. So one idea is now to take, because the queen would be exposed. Obviously, we're also just threatening to take like this and win a pawn. So there's a lot of pressure here. They decided to go e5 to open up their bishops, but now a very nice tactic ended the game. Rajabov played rook takes d3, because after rook takes d3, queen to f5, seals the deal. There's pressure on the rook. You can't defend the rook. If you defend like this, then we can simply take on c4, hit the rook again, and win from there. Rook to g5 was played, but in fact, white resigned after playing the move rook g5 because, of course, that simply gives away the rook, and this is a completely winning position. So, very simple plans, as you noticed, for black. You play on the queen side, but that is largely to gain some space and to develop your pieces effectively. Your general play tends to be on the king side when it comes to opening up files. But you didn't see that being as big of a thing in this game, frankly, because of the fact that the center was open. So let's go ahead all the way back and look at the positions that arise after the move d5 here, where the center remains closed, because now the kingside expansion, as you might imagine, becomes a lot more of a powerful thing. And, so powerful that you just rush to it, right? There's no need to beat around the bush. There's no need to kind of prepare it because the center is closed. There's no counterplay. There's nothing to be worried about. f5. And this is sort of, again, the way that you justify the knight being on h6. It prepares the move f5, so it activates itself into the game very well. As you can see here, the knight, in fact, then comes to d4. One of the other things to, of course, take notice of, whenever the pawn comes to d5, as we saw a lot in the Petrosian chapter, the c5 square becomes a very valuable one. So we want to take control of that, and you will see that in this game as well. So b6, threatening at some point to bring the knight to c5. And indeed, that happens on the next move. We have a trade of bishops, and bishop to f2, queen to d7, and a5, stopping the pawn coming with b4. So these are the sort of positions that you can expect as black. You have a lot of control of the dark squares, as is evident by all of your pawns being on the dark squares. You have two very powerful knights, and you have the open f-file because of your expansion on the king side. You can then bring your other rook to the e-file as well. So knight e2, knight f5, keeping the knights on the board, at least temporarily, very temporarily. Knight to g3, queen to g6. We have takes, and a complete transformation into the endgame. Now, this endgame is objectively completely drawn, but black has certainly some ideas. The main one is to utilize the b file, which is completely open. There's also the idea of at some point activating the bishop, potentially through, by virtue of sacrificing a pawn with e4. And indeed, this is what happens. This is a very thematic idea. The bishop now breathes fire along this entire diagonal, potentially along this entire diagonal. It is completely worth giving away a pawn to activate it to its complete potential. So bishop d4 check, and a4, the idea of which, very genius. You want to go rook to b8, but you don't want to allow the annoying b3. So you begin by going a4, stopping b3 from coming with as much power, and now your idea is to go rook b8 on the next moves. In fact, rook fb8 was played here, which is logical because now b3, which is forced in this position, is even worse because now you even have control over the a-file. So very nice strategic thinking. This is now following a game, once again, Rajabov with the black side. And you can see that, black slowly put pressure on the queen side, eventually, took over the position. The rook is better than the counterpart, the bishop better than the knight. The position here is super safe and solid for black. Even this king is pretty active and can cause some threats to the opposing king. So black is far better. Obviously, you can't take because of the check here, winning the knight. Eventually, there was check and rook to b3, pinning this knight here. There's ideas of h4. That's the major threat here. King h2 was played, h4 anyways, getting rid of the knight and then continuing the slow descent of the king into the position more and more. This is very deadly, and eventually black managed to transform the positional advantages into a material advantage. They're up a pawn now, and, the game continues. Obviously, bishop to e5, very genius idea, hitting the knight and also hitting f4. If you take, we take, and then take. Super nice finishing touches here. But indeed, that's all it is because this game is already over. As is pretty clear, there's rook to f3, the pawns march up the board, and white finally threw in the towel. So the final thing that I wanted to look at is the move bishop c1 in this position, which, if you remember, is the other option that white has, but this one is not so dangerous. It's not very ambitious, as is pretty clear, because now white has sacrificed a lot of time. So their advantage of being the first player to play a move is completely gone out the window, and it's therefore a very equal position, more so than it is even on move 1. And so the positions are very dry. White doesn't really have the ability to play for much, especially in the way that we're going to approach this, which is very simple and very forcing. We're going to take, they're going to take, we're going to go f5, we're hitting the knight, and here they're likely just going to castle. There are alternatives in this position, but castling is best. They can go h3, for example. And here our knight has a couple of options. It can come to h6, like we're already very familiar with, but there's also now these central squares that, you can certainly consider placing your knight in. So in this position, castles is the main move, but now we're going to take on e4. They're going to take the free piece. We're going to take, and then take the knight. And now we're up a pawn. They're going to take that pawn back. Very forcing. And now we go knight to c6 to defend the bishop and defend over b7. And material is equal. Our pieces, I would argue, are a little better because this queen is quite weak and susceptible to being hit. And so if anything, black has at least a practical advantage here, but it's very minimal, especially once the bishops get traded. Bishop e3, queen takes e3, queen to h4, getting ready to bring the rooks into the game. And after something like f4, getting the rook into the game, and then queen to h5. I mean, no player can really claim an advantage here. It's a very equal position. We're going to follow a game here just to kind of show you the ways to maneuver around these sort of positions that you might get. We're going to follow again Rajabov. So knight to e7 here. The only benefit that white has is this powerful knight, so we're going to neutralize that by playing knight e7. If they take, we're very happy with this because rook takes and we have now complete control. If anything, now we're a little better. The other option is, of course, to take on c7, but this moves tactically to queen to c5 check, and we're going to pick off the knight. So in the game, the move rook to e1 was played. We had a trade of knights, and then queen to f5, and then h5, right? So these sort of dry positions, if you want to play for something more, and you don't have to, right? One of the approaches in this position, which is completely fine, is to just bring the queen back, like queen f7, maybe queen e7, and just trade the rooks, trade the other rooks, eventually, get the king in, go into a completely drawn queen's endgame, and, both players can try a little there, but it's likely just going to fizzle out into a very easy to play draw. So that's one approach. The other approach, if you're a bit more ambitious and you have the luxury of kind of deciding the mindset and how the game will develop, because again, white surrendered their first move advantage when they played bishop c1. So the other approach is to be a bit more ambitious. You can go h5, you can go h4. This is how you generate an attack from really nothing. And in this game, as you'll see, it did indeed pay off. Objectively, this is still drawn, but the idea is that we've traded a piece, so the pawn structure here is far weaker, and we can target that by going g5. We're threatening to just win a pawn. They can't take this pawn because they lose their queen. We're starting to pose some questions that they're going to have to answer for. So rook f1, and here, the very simple rook to f7. They still can't take because they lose their queen. So queen to e3 getting off of that, and now queen takes d5, right? That was the downside. When the queen went out, it no longer defends the pawn, so takes. Now their idea was to take back on g5, but of course this endgame is not really what they wanted, because their pawns are a little ruined, and in fact we're going to be up one pawn once we take on a2, and after they give this check, we're now going to be up another pawn on b2. White did not play this very accurately, and in fact, since the move h5 happened, they collapsed very quickly, far quicker than I would have expected them to. But still, it's not very easy or fun to play this as white. You're constantly under pressure, and it's something that can lead you to make these collapses like you see here. So black is up 2 pawns. The game's completely over. In fact, queen to e7 was played, but white resigned right after this move because the simple queen to f7 will guarantee a very safe and drawn position. There's no more checks now. You can't take here. Of course, if you trade, you're completely lost. The main takeaways from this video: don't play into their idea of playing the main line. Target this bishop immediately. And you're likely going to get a very interesting pawn structure where if they open up the center or they close the center, doesn't really matter. We're still playing for f5 at some point and expanding on the king side. And generally speaking, we have great plays simple plans and simple ideas. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Make sure to subscribe if you're new around here. Like this video if you learned something new from it, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.